Are we good? Hello to everyone. Hello, hello. Lovely to see so many people here this evening, but no surprise, we have a great speaker, Will Hayward, who's established himself as really the leading, one of the leading journalist on Welsh politics, Welsh society, Welsh matters. He has got himself a column, he just told me, in The Guardian, which is an extremely difficult thing to get, and you're doing that once a month minimum, was it, you said? So that's a very big deal for you, and you say you're tending to do 2 a month, and also he has a very successful Substack channel to which you should subscribe, because it is his living. So the more of you, I'm sure you'll tell them about that and how you can subscribe to that, but it is a very, very balanced, analytical, and reasonable and well-written summary of what's gone on in Welsh politics in the last week. Yes? What's a Substack? Can you start with that?
Yeah, I'll come on to it.
You'll come on to it. It's the way that journalists make a living now, writing online and trying to get people to pay them to do so. Many of you may have read Will's second book, which was on Can Wales Be Independent? It didn't take a very firm view on yes or no, but it did give a very good analysis of the data, which is extremely difficult. One of the main points of the book was that so much of the data is England and Wales data that it's very difficult to disaggregate it and work out what's happening in Wales and what's happening in England and how it compares and how you would go about assessing the case for independence on the basis of those numbers, because the numbers basically don't exist for Wales because of the history of gathering all the statistics. So, you're going to tell us about the challenges facing Wales, and you're very welcome.
Can people at the back hear me? Amazing. I always think being told you're one of Wales's best journalists when there's only 5 of us is always not the compliment that I hoped it would be, but thank you, thanks for having me. When Owen rang me to discuss what we do the topic on, he said, what about we do a presentation on the challenges Wales faces? And I was like, okay, yeah, sounds good. How long have I got? And he said, half an hour. And I said, shit. So what I've done is I've done an overview of a few things which I've covered recently journalistically. This isn't comprehensive, but I hope it'll be insightful. And I'm going to finish with just a brief overview of where the kind of political parties stand in the run-up to the election in 2026. And then we'll go on to questions, because I imagine you guys know what you want to know more than I do. So yeah, we'll go through them now. So I've got a clicker. I've got a pointer. Can people see this? Okay. Great. This is where I was actually going to put my credentials, and then realised I sent it without actually filling this bit in. I was going to come to this last, so it actually probably does sum them up. So I'm going to start with the Welsh NHS. So yeah, the irony is you're going to wait a long time for this talk. So the Welsh NHS is the biggest issue as Welsh Labour sees it at the moment, in terms of their main priority. It's the stick which is used to beat them with. I think what shocked me most, and it really kind of came up during COVID, was the challenges around the structure. So 7 health boards for a population the size of Greater Manchester. Obviously, I don't need to speak to you guys about the challenges in Betsy Cadwallader. Statistically, many of you are probably on a waiting list. Anyone on a waiting list? I'm on a waiting list. Oh, this is a very healthy group. Excellent. Or you just don't want to talk about your personal details in a large public forum. But what I was surprised at was we talk about the Welsh NHS, and really it isn't a single unified organisation. So if you wanted to send a nurse from Aneurin Bevan in Newport to Cardiff and Vale in Cardiff, it is like sending a worker from Sainsbury's to Tesco. It's really not a very joined up thing. And the problem with that is when things like, a pandemic happens, it can be that can be quite an issue, especially when you want to allocate resources. So at the moment, Jeremy Miles is the health minister. The 3 people you can see on your screen who I mean, one of them looks really miserable, one of them looks a bit miserable, and the other one looks like she's just been made First Minister by surprise. It turns out they were the previous three. It turns out failing in the Welsh NHS is the way to become the First Minister, so I imagine Jeremy Miles is very excited right now. I think you can't really talk about the Welsh NHS without talking about the Welsh-specific challenges. So fundamentally, delivering healthcare to the same amount of people is harder in Wales than it is in England. There's several reasons for this. I know many of you will know this, but this context will be helpful when we go onto the next few slides. So Wales has got an older population. Part of it is because people like to retire here. And we also have a sicker population, and a lot of that is down to industrial heritage. Essentially, but the biggest challenge in delivering healthcare here compared to England is how spread out everyone is. We're going to go to a slide in a minute which shows how much of a challenge that is, because ultimately, if all of your population live within a few cities, it's a hell of a lot cheaper per person to deliver that healthcare than if they're spread out over hundreds and hundreds of miles. So I'm going to talk to you about the waiting lists. So this graph. These are the numbers of patient pathways. So these are not individual people. So if you were waiting for a hernia operation and a hip replacement, not only are you having a terrible, terrible time, but you will be on there twice. So the one at the top is the number of people who are waiting over a year for an appointment. The blue one in the middle is the people who are waiting over a year for their first appointment. So you've presented to the GP, they've said we'll refer you, and you've waited over a year. And that bottom one, the one in the purple, that is waits of over 2 years. Now, to be clear, that isn't 2 year waits, that's over 2 years. About a year ago, I did a Freedom of Information request to find out the total lengths of time, and they do go up to 6 years that some people have been waiting.
Can I just ask, that first year is very small.
Yes, that first year is February 2020. Right. So this is just before the pandemic. So you can see the impact that the pandemic had on the waits. Now, the first thing to say is those 1 year waits, that pink line, before the pandemic, that was still there. COVID didn't take a healthy health service and make it sick. There was already issues there. They were exacerbated by the pandemic. But if you look at that purple one, there were almost there were very, very few 2 year waits up until about 2015. And we're going to come on to how that changed in a minute. The other thing I wanted to kind of point out with this is England has no 2 year waits at the moment. The 56 million people in England, there are almost none who are waiting over 2 years. Few reasons for that. Part of it is they count in a slightly different way, but ultimately those 2 year waits have been cleared in England, and a big part of that is because they have much, much more private healthcare provision, and the UK government have been more inclined to use it than the Welsh government have. So, this graph is the total waits. In fact, I'm going to take you back one. You notice how, actually I've got a pointer, why am I doing this? Here, after the pandemic, we saw all of them managed to come down a bit. They did actually manage to make some inroads into that. But as you can see, they then, around here, have like stabilized, and they haven't been able to make much of a difference. Now, this number for the purples is currently 24,000. So when I interviewed Elena Morgan a month ago, she said that by May, that 24,000 would be 8,000. So that's a 66% fall. Now, they have made that, like here, that is that kind of speed of falling. But considering for the last 2 years, they haven't managed to do that, we're fairly skeptical. Now, part of the way that they're going to do this is through hubs. So one of the challenges is you book people in for an operation. It's all booked in, they're ready to go. It's a massive organizational feat for families involved, isn't it? Because you might have kids that take time off work to take you to the hospital, everything's ready, and then suddenly there's a 3-car crash on the A55, and that space has to, that theatre space has to go, so things get cancelled. So what the Welsh Government are trying to do now is create hubs around Wales where they will have hospitals where all they're doing is just hip replacements. It's like a production line, person in, hip replacement, out, and that's how they're planning on working through it. It does very much, just going back to that thing of why I think it's going to be hard to do this again when we're here, is because after COVID, there was a lot of people who had fairly simple procedures, and they worked through them really, really quickly. Whereas a lot of the people who are now still on waiting list, it's much more complex. By the fact they've been on the waiting list for so long, their health has deteriorated more. So this is now a harder list to work through. This isn't going to be various parts of this talk which aren't miserable. Could I just clarify? So these are the total weights. Now, part of the challenge is when you start looking at the long-term weights and go, right, we're going to clear the 2-year weights, is you start to get into a mentality of whether you're focusing on need or whether you're focusing on time. Because if somebody has waited for 2 years for an appointment, obviously that's terrible for them. But then if you've got a child who needs an appointment over their eyesight and might have sight loss and they've waited 2 weeks, you've got to think about how you prioritize. And that's a conversation that health boards are having every single day at the moment. I was speaking to them. It's a real challenge for them. Now, as you can see here, we've got some of the great minds of our time that we've photoshopped together, some of the great statesmen who've really led us through some of the toughest times. So it does beg that question of who's to blame, because since 2010, the Welsh Government's stock response, when challenged, has been, our budget's been cut. The Tories in Westminster, they're cutting our budget. And there is some merit to that, but when we use that argument, it diminishes what are serious management failings within how the health service has been governed at a ministerial level. I'm not denigrating individuals within the health service. A lot of my family work within the health service. The reason I spotlight these stories is because I think they deserve to be supported. So this is the amount of money that Wales has had since 2010. So that 100 figure is the figure that it was at in 2010, and the graph shows that it's gone up. It's gone up every single year. It went down a little bit to 2012, but then it has been increasing. Okay. However, so that actually looks quite good. You know, you're 30% up in 10 years. Take that. Problem is, when you adjust for inflation, this is where the graph goes. So actually, if you look from 2010, it was not until 2015 that we actually started to get above the 2010 levels. The problem is, if you then add real terms per person, because actually the population's gone up. So the amount of people you're having to provide healthcare for has also gone up. So actually, if we look at it in terms of per person, we're kind of here until we go above 2010 levels, and that's 2017. But on top of that, that bottom one is accounting for age, because the population has not only got bigger, it's got older. And the older you are, the more likely you are to require health service support. So you can't probably see the actual lines on it very well, actually, now I turn around. But basically, it's not until we get to 2019 that we hit, again, the funding we had in 2010, when you take into account that the population's got bigger, the population's got older, and we've had inflation. So that, in a nutshell, is why there has been challenges within the health service. And that is funding from UK government. Can't deny that. That's a fact. But Wales actually does get proportionally more than England when it comes to funding. So this graph is, let me explain it to you. This isn't all graphs as well. It's not all misery. It's not all graphs. I promise you it was worth coming out on your Thursday night. So that blue line is what would happen, how much Wales would put into the health service if they passed on all the equivalent health funding they get from England. So England spends this much on health. England spends that much on health. That's how much Wales gets as a consequential of that blue line. The red line is how much of that consequential the Welsh Government passes on to the health service. So as you'll see here, you've got, so this is 2000. So here, you've got this arrow here. This was after the cuts at the start of austerity, 2012, 2013. The Welsh Government didn't, because the Tories ring-fenced NHS funding in England. They said, we are not going to cut the NHS budget. They cut almost everything else. But then what happened was, the Welsh Government said, right, what we're going to do is, because we're getting a lot of health funding money, we're going to take some of that health funding money and we're going to put it in other areas, primarily education, health, education, housing, stuff like that. Because their argument was, well, housing has a big impact on health, education has a big impact on health. But then, when Wales saw a massive plummeting in health standards, places like the Daily Mail started doing headlines like "Offa's Dyke is the line between life and death," and suddenly the Welsh government went, "Shit!" And that's when suddenly they increased it again. I've cut this off at 2020 because if I was to include the COVID period, we'd need the graph to go up to about there because suddenly there was a massive influx in health spending. So what you've had, if you're looking at places to point the blame, you've got a UK government which has absolutely cut the funding Wales gets. But you also have a Welsh government who's made a political decision to not put that money into health. Now, I'm not saying if that is a good or bad thing, but that is something they have done. And I think that's something that's worth bearing in mind when they say, well, we're not getting as much money. It's like, you're not, but also you've chosen where you're going to put this. And they're political choices. So I think a lot of people don't necessarily know the context behind that. So just to, brighten the mood. So I'm going to talk about poverty, but how ways that we kind of look to solve it. So there's 600,000 kids in Wales. Of those, 1 in 3 are in poverty. There's lots of ways you can measure poverty. Rishi Sunak used absolute poverty. So absolute poverty's definition was you are below 60% of the median income in 2010. But that 2010 thing never changed. So basically, as inflation happened, everyone eventually came out of poverty. And so he was like, wow, we've cut poverty by 90%. Isn't this amazing? Even though inflation had just ran like rampant. There's a lot of debate about this. One of the main definitions of poverty that charities use that work in this area is relative poverty. So that's households which are below 60% of the median income. Of those 600,000 children in Wales, 90% of them are living in what's called severe poverty, which is below 50% of the median income. The reason I focus on children is because if you look at poverty in Wales, it's children bear the brunt of living in poverty. And it's quite simple why, over the years, child poverty has been higher in pensioners. It's because of the triple lock. Poverty is essentially a financial calculation, and the triple lock has enabled that to be maintained. And I'm not standing here advocating for pensioner poverty. Let's just be clear, especially not to this audience. Just to be clear. Nothing at all, absolutely nothing. But it's just to kind of illustrate that thing. But I think when we talk about poverty generally, it's worth pointing out that there's a lot of different kinds of poverty. So I made this map because I'm a bit of a loser. Now, this map of Wales, essentially the darker the area, the higher the rates of poverty. So I ranked all nearly 2,000 LSOAs, which are essentially the smallest unit of measurement of an area in Wales. I think it's about a third of a council ward. And I mapped them across Wales. And the darker ones are the ones with the highest poverty. The lighter ones are the ones with the lowest levels of poverty by that measure. Now, it looks like, oh my God, what is happening in the valleys, doesn't it? But I think, I do a lot of reporting from the valleys, but I think the problem is when you get into poverty as a valleys problem, it ignores the huge amounts of poverty that you have in cities and in coastal communities as well. And I think that has been a problem with how we've allocated funding within Wales. So let's give you an example. So this one here on the left is a snapshot of the valleys. And as you can see, you've actually got pockets of white, which are actually not have very, very little poverty at all. This one here is Cardiff. Now, that white block in the middle is the Principality Stadium, Cardiff City Centre, the plush flats. The one next to it here is Riverside West. And that is the area of Wales with the highest level of poverty. So the areas with the highest poverty and the lowest poverty are next to each other, and they look at each other across the River Taff. And what's interesting is you can stand with your back to Riverside, and you can look out, and you can actually see £3 billion of investment funding. And if you look across from the other way, well, I don't think they do. So I think it's just quite interesting that poverty is not, and if we just go back to that graph, you probably can't make it out, but that North Wales coast and around Anglesey, this is a real problem. This is an all Wales problem. This is not just a South Wales Valleys problem. It just happens to be that this is a very concentrated area. Cool. Now, how do you tackle poverty? Now, one of the key ways there's lots and lots of ways you do it, but a key way is infrastructure. So I'm going to talk to you about rail. So this next slide I'm going to show you shows all the areas of the UK where the railway line is electrified. Okay, let's just have a look. Can I just point out, the people who've cut off Anglesey is the Rail Freight Electrification Service. It is not me. I did not make this map. Don't chase me out of here. So I'm not sure how well you can make it out, but essentially this big empty area is Wales. And I think, I don't want to get ire from people in Devon and Cornwall. Yes, we see you, Devon and Cornwall. You also haven't got any. But ultimately, this is a huge, huge issue for Wales. You'll also notice that any of the rail track within Wales is only going south, east to west, west to east. It's not going north to south. I forgot how wanky that picture was when I put this in. Actually, now I look at it. So contrary to everything you can see on the screen, I'm not a prick. I don't know, how do people are aware of the issues around Wales and HS2 funding? So just to give you a very brief context, some of you nodded, some of you looked at me like, you're a knob, why have you put that photo up? So HS2 is depends how you cut it, but if we say £80 billion, once in a generation investment in rail in England, okay? You can argue that it's a terrible investment, and I think you can make that case very strongly, but there's no doubting the amount of money that has gone into that. It's not an inch of that track is in Wales, and yet the Treasury in 2012, 2013 decided to mark it as an England and Wales project. So because they defined it as an England and Wales project, that meant that Wales got absolutely no Barnet consequential from that. Okay, Scotland gets about 6 to 7 billion. Northern Ireland gets about 2 to 3 billion. Wales should get about 4 to 5 billion pounds, and it's going to get nothing, essentially because of this Treasury sleight of hand. It was a way of saving money, and I always think when we talk about figures like in billions, it's quite hard to work out what they really mean. So I've spoken to let's just say experts. I know Michael Gove hates them, but we'll talk about experts. For £5 billion, you could electrify the whole of the North Wales main line, which I know people promise every other day and never seem to do. You could integrate North Wales trains with Merseyside to have a much more regular service. You could integrate it with local bus travel within North Wales as well. You could connect Aberystwyth to Carmarthenshire. You could do the Swansea Bay Metro. You could do the Cardiff Bay Metro, and you could electrify the South Wales main line all the way to Swansea. Because if we go back to that, you'll notice actually that's in orange, and the Tories cancelled the plan to electrify it from London to Swansea. They stopped just after Cardiff, which means the trains have to swap over essentially how they are run when they get halfway across South Wales. So £5 billion would go, £4 billion would go a hell of a long way in Wales, but they've said no. And the reason that they've said no, well, to start with, they said that it will benefit Wales because people in North Wales will be able to get to London quicker via Crewe, which I think is kind of symptomatic of the problem with how people view taking on poverty and issues, is that the way to make Wales better is to make it closer to England. It's not to make things in Wales better in of themselves. But then they cancelled the line all the way to Crewe, so you don't actually get that benefit at all anyway. David T.C. Davis, who was then the Welsh secretary when I asked him about this, said, well, Welsh people will be able to use it when they go to England, which is, that's like saying I'm going to cut the Welsh NHS because when Welsh people go to Norwich, they can use the hospitals there. So Welsh Labour were very, very irate about this. They said this was an outrage. We've got to do something about this. Mark Drakeford said that he was going to take Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, very briefly, and Rishi Sunak to court over this because it was such an outrage. Jo Stevens, the current Secretary of State to Wales, when she was running for election, said, yes, we deserve that money. Labour are now in power, and the tune has changed a little bit. They're now saying, well, I just don't think there's any justification for this. Wales is absolutely going to benefit from HS2. So I thought that was a groan. It was actually someone outside. So it's one of the key ways of improving Wales is additional infrastructure funding, and I think one of the biggest problems is we don't have control of it. And part of the reason we don't have devolution of rail is because we rejected it. So in 2008, Tony, was it still Blair? So 2006, Blair's government offered Wales devolution of rail, which would have meant that money would have been automatically come to Wales as a consequential. He decided not to do that. No, Wales said, no, we don't want to do that because we were scared of the liability on the lines. We didn't think we had the expertise to do it. So, yeah, quite. And I think that has proved to be one of Wales' biggest mistakes because we have lost out on billions and billions and billions of pounds, not just from HS2, but over the last 20 years because of that decision. Going to go on to how are we doing for time?
We are good.
Oh, cool. So I'm going to talk about climate change, but specifically because we're in rural Wales in a agricultural context, because I drove past a lot of no farmers, no food signs on the way up. So I thought it would be quite interesting to look at that. So Wales accounts for more, agriculture in Wales is a higher proportion of emissions than it is in other parts of the UK. Not mainly because like 80-90% of Wales is managed agriculture. The agriculture as a percentage of Welsh emissions is even higher now because we've just closed Port Talbot steelworks. So there's a chimney in Port Talbot. I went there the day before it closed, and 20% of Wales's emissions went up one chimney. Just one chimney in Port Talbot was 20% of the emissions. It's huge. So almost every industry in the UK has decarbonised to quite a significant degree. Agriculture hasn't, and the main reason for that is it's really hard to decarbonise a sheep. Like, you can't stop the sheep from eating and farting and shitting. And ultimately, that is the problem. Our direct methane from emissions of livestock makes up 61% of Wales's emissions. Let me show you how this graph. So the black line is where Wales is at in terms of agricultural emissions. So that bit there, that's where we are now. That's where we've gone for the last 10 years. So actually up slightly, this is where we have to go to hit the targets. For those nerds in the room, it is million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, just so if you're interested in that. If you are interested in that, you're an absolute loser like me. So a key part of the Welsh Government plan is tree planting. People are furious because of all these trees been planted. Well, people who message me on Facebook are. But Wales is massively behind when it comes to tree planting. So that black line is the trees that the Welsh Government actually plants. The purple line at the top, this is tree planting per year. The purple line at the top, I think this might be 100,000 trees, by the way. I've cut off the thing on the side. The purple line at the top is how many trees the Climate Change Committee, which is an independent body of experts, say we need to plant. And the yellow is the Welsh Government's own target, which is below the target, which we need to be at. And the black line is where we're at. So the Welsh Government were really thinking, right, how are we going to do this? How are we going to plant these trees? And a key way they can do that is through the SFS. So this is the Sustainable Farming Scheme. This is a cattle market in Welshpool full of the most untamable beasts in the world, Welsh farmers. You cannot domesticate them. So the SFS is the Sustainable Farming Scheme. So that replaced the EU legislation that which was the Common Agricultural Policy. You might be thinking, we left the EU a long time ago, why hasn't this been replaced? And that would be a very, very fair criticism. So this is all up in the air at the moment. So the Welsh Government had said to farmers, as part of this, to receive your UK government, your Welsh Government subsidies, because farming is heavily subsidised, you have got to have 10% of your land covered in trees. Now, certain farmers were like, that's easy. I can easily accommodate that, especially if you've got land which isn't particularly fertile. Actually, planting trees there and receiving money for it is actually not a bad use of the land. If you own swaths of farmland and you're getting told you need to reduce that by 10%, that was a real concern, and a legitimate concern for lots of farmers. There was widespread protests, so now the Welsh Government have rowed back on that and said they're going to make it optional. Now, that is fine, but if you're going to make it optional, you're going to need to pay people a lot of money to do it if they don't have to. And we're going to find out in the summer how they're going to try and do that. I think it will be an absolute cock-out. cop out, and they're going to kick the can really far down the road. Knowing some of the people in the Senate, it might be a cock out. We're running a bit short on time, so I'm going to just talk you through a few things. I want to talk to you about arts funding. So it's been in the news a lot. My last Guardian column I did on arts funding and how Wales has been, I think, shortchanged in terms of arts funding. The next slide is how Wales compares per head of population on arts funding. So this is us on £69 per person. This is the UK average on £91 per person. Now bear in mind, Wales is part of that average, so we are pulling that down. So overall in the UK, the rest of the UK receives a hell of a lot more in terms of per head arts funding. Part of the reason for that is Welsh Government have pulled money out of arts funding in order to go into the Welsh NHS. So, you know, that's a debate to be had. The ones at the top, you've got the ones you'd expect, like Iceland, Luxembourg, Norway, but like France is there, 230 million, £230 per person is spent on the arts in Wales in France compared to 70 in Wales. It's the same for sport. This is where Wales is on sport funding. You can point, there's huge evidence that sports and the arts and culture have a huge impact on the health of a population. So you start to see that every facet of Welsh society is under sustained pressure, and when one part comes under pressure, it then presents in other parts, and most notably the NHS. So we keep pouring money into the health service, and I understand why they're doing it, but actually it's because of a lack of long-term thinking. There's other things you can put this money to, which means that you're treating the causes rather than the symptoms. So this is just an example. I'm going to finish with some national park funding. How long have we done? Okay. Got some national park funding. So 15 national parks in the UK. How many in Wales? 3? What are they? Brecon, Snowdonia, and the Pembrokeshire Coast Path. No one cares about the Pembrokeshire Coast Path, do they? So this is how much. The ones in blue are the national parks in England. The ones in red are Scotland, and the ones in green are Wales. So the ones in green are Wales. So Banai and Pembrokeshire Coast Path are the two lowest when it comes to grant funding. Snowdonia, despite being very large compared to some others, is quite low down. Areas like the Lake District, Peak District, Yorkshire Dales, really, really high up. What you'll notice about the 3 lowest funded ones, so the Beacons, Pembs Coast Path, and Northumberland, is that they are adjacent to the poorest parts of the UK. So I think there's a big debate to be had on how we use our national parks, because national parks should be an absolute jewel for the nation. They should be absolute assets for the nation. They should be carbon sinks for the nation. And at the moment, because of how laws around them work, essentially they're for people in the main they're used by people of means to buy something that can't physically change. They're buying themselves a postcard. And there's a real big conversation to be had about that. But Wales are the lowest funded. So shall I whip through the parties, or should we go? I'm going to give you a little snapshot of the political parties, and then we'll go on to questions. So, Labour, this picture of Leonard Morgan was taken for my newsletter, which you should definitely subscribe to. I'll explain more about that in a second. Welsh Labour are the most successful democratic party in history. Now, don't get angry with me, depends how you measure it, but in terms of winning elections, in every Senedd and general election since 1922, Welsh Labour have been the largest party. So for over 100 years, Wales has voted Labour. No other democratic party in the world has ever had a record like that. And the reason I know that is because Welsh Labour tell me every 45 seconds. They've had a bit of a nightmare with Vaughan Gething. So Vaughan Gething dreamed all his life of becoming a First Minister and just turned out to be very bad at it. He had, for those of you who haven't followed it, in his campaign to be First Minister, he took £200,000 from a man who was a convicted criminal, who had been convicted of dumping waste in a nature reserve. On the same day he took that money from that man, the man's company had put in an application to build a solar farm on the outskirts of Cardiff, which would require Welsh Government approval. Didn't break any rules, just to be clear. I know this is going on YouTube. He didn't break any rules. but there was a feeling among some people within his own party that it was a little bit smelly, quite literally. So he, bear in mind, he took £200,000 for a campaign where the spending limit was $36,000. The way he got round that was the spending limit was just for materials like leaflets, posters, stuff like that. It didn't count for staff, so he essentially spent £200,000 to hire a call centre worth of people to ring round Labour members and get his vote out. Jeremy Miles raised about 25,000. Vaughan Gething raised 200,000, and he won with 51% of the vote. So this caused a lot of disharmony within Labour. It was genuinely one of the most bitter. I mean, politics is horrible. I mean, political parties, the only thing they hate more than their opponents is each other. But I couldn't believe how the infighting that there was, the briefing. It was a really nasty time for the party. He ended up stepping down. Leonard Morgan took over. People don't realise how influential Mark Drakeford still is within that. In many ways, he is the First Minister behind the scenes. Real, so much power still within that party. And the big problem they've got now is for 15 years, their default setting has been, please don't blame us, it's those bastards down the M4. Problem is now the bastards down the M4 are also them. Which is going to be a real issue for them because I don't know if you heard during the election campaign, Leonard Morgan couldn't stop saying how amazing it was going to be when we had a Labour government at either side of the M4. From speaking to Labour MPs who tend to be much more London-centric and less pro-devolution, and Labour MSs, there is starting to be real concern within Welsh Labour that they are not going to get given a bone by UK Labour. And the fact that we have to rely on people giving us a bone, I think, underlines the real issues within how we fund and how we manage this United Kingdom. Something we can get into in questions if you want to. So in 2026, a poll came out 3 weeks ago which suggested that they could be in third place behind Reform and Plaid Cymru, which is, for the most successful democratic party in history, don't you know, would be quite a fall. So we've got Reen talking to some dirty hack. Reen, who also, obviously you guys will probably know, one of the best jawlines in politics. Plaid Cymru were very, very divided under Adam Price. I don't know how much you followed the issues within Plaid. It got very nasty at points. There was a internal report found that the party had failed to have a zero tolerance to sexual harassment. Adam Price felt that the best person to deal with this problem was Adam Price, and he was ousted by his own members after a shamefully long time. So Plaid are now back on track, I would say. People, I think Rena surprised people on how well he's performed. He gained quite a good profile during the general election. He was seen as being competent. He's brought the party together. But they are really treading a tightrope at the moment because they are trying to make inroads in the valleys, which is essentially what only Leanne Wood has really ever managed to do. And they got rid of her as leader. And they're trying to appeal to that kind of urban, socially liberal people in cities and towns. And they're also trying to appeal to a more small-c conservative countryside farmers. And at the moment, they're doing that by just saying different things to both sides and hoping the others don't notice. But during the election, they are going to have to come down on a side of, are you going to annoy environmentalists or are you going to annoy farmers? And when they come to that, that is going to be a really tricky thing for them to manage. My second book was on independence. I'll talk about it more if people have questions. I don't want to get too into it now, mainly because life's too short, isn't it? But the Welsh Conservatives. Now I put Welsh in speech marks there. So they had a leader until recently, Andrew R.T. Davies. This is an actual poem he put on Twitter. He was Wales's leader of the opposition when he sent that. Can you imagine if a leader to the general election, Keir Starmer, had been tweeting like limericks and little poems he'd written about wokeness? He has been forced to resign. He's been replaced by this titan of our time, Darren Miller, who actually has a second job distributing Bibles. He went to Ukraine to distribute Bibles with his evangelical Christian charity, which he runs, and receives £20,000 a year on top of his £100,000 Leader of the Opposition salary. But apparently it's very rude to ask him about that, and he won't give interviews if you are going to ask him about it, which is nice. He recently got into hot water because, did anyone see he went to America? So Labour were struggling to pass their budget. They have 30 of 60 Senate members, so they needed another party to support them. They were negotiating hard with the Welsh Liberal Democrats. Probably shouldn't make Welsh Liberal Democrats plural, there's only one of them. The Welsh Liberal Democrat, Jane Dodds, which is hilariously close to Todd. So I got a press release from the Welsh Tories the day before this vote saying Labour deserve to lose on their terrible budget vote. The next morning I got a call from someone within the Welsh Tories saying Darren Miller's not actually going to be in attendance at the vote, so the vote is going to pass automatically. He'd gone to a prayer meeting in Washington, D.C. with Donald Trump. Yes, the Leader of the Opposition allowed the government's budget to pass because he went to a prayer meeting with Donald Trump. I imagine Donald Trump was delighted that Darren Miller attended. I'm sure. Oh, Jesus. It's just so, journalistically, it's great because it's just like shooting fish. I don't even need to be a good journalist. They miss key budgets to go to prayer meetings with Donald Trump. It's incredible. The big problem the Tories have is they have never, ever been able to create a Welsh identity for themselves. There isn't even technically a Welsh Conservatives. It's essentially like, Oxfordshire Conservatives. There isn't a defined leader of the Welsh Conservatives. Darren Miller is the leader of the Conservative group in the Senedd. Many Tories will argue that it's the Shadow Secretary of State for Wales who has a seat in, I think, Wickham, who is actually the leader of the Welsh Conservatives. And this inability to define this Welshness is why they've really struggled historically. Because I think there is a place for a moderate conservative party within Wales. There is a huge socially conservative branch in voter base in Wales, which if they could actually tap into, Wales desperately needs real and credible opposition to Welsh Labour. And I think the fact that the Welsh Tories have completely phoned it in for decades has actually really hurt governance in Wales because it's allowed Labour to be pretty shit a lot of the time. And actually, this is part of the problem. So we'll finish with reform. In fact, what have I done there? There we go. I interviewed Lee Anderson at the Reform conference. Now, I'm going to try and show you a video of him. You might notice he seems a bit drunk. Don't let that mislead you. I'm pretty sure is this going on YouTube? He was absolutely sober, and he was an upstanding individual. So let me just see if I can show you this. Do you know how I can get that? Do I need to minimize the? Because at the moment it's not showing up on there. I've clicked through. If I end the show. Oh no, it's.
Tracy, what do you say?
Well, let's F5. I've completely messed this up, guys. Sorry. Long story short, when we speak to reform, I think one of the problems with how journalists treat reform is they don't hold them to the same standards that people do for other parties. I think, Plaid Cymru will say, we want to nationalise Port Talbot Steelworks. And people will go, well, how are you going to pay for that? How is this going to work? How are you going to do this? Nigel Farage will come in and say, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And at no point will anyone go, how are you going to do that? It's just like, well, Nigel Farage just said this. Let's type this out immediately. So I think one of the keys to scrutinising reform in Wales is asking what are they actually going to do? What is their plan for Wales? So I asked Lee Anderson. Firstly, I asked him about Betsy Cadwallader Health Board, but I didn't mention Betsy Cadwallader Health Board. So he said that the Welsh NHS was in bits and it needed a full change. So I said, well, the largest public sector organisation in Wales is currently in special measures. What would you do about it? And he just said, I don't know what that is. Exactly. And so I said, so how are you going to improve the Welsh NHS? And he said, we're going to cut the waste. And I said, okay, so what waste would you look to cut? And his response was, not put this on, his response his response was, we're going to cut the waste. There's lots of waste. I said, well, can you give me an example? And he said, well, we could easily be able to save hundreds of millions of pounds by cutting this waste. Now, I pointed out to him that £100 million is 1% of the NHS budget. So if you cut 200 million pounds of waste, which I'm not convinced is quite a hard thing to do, and not have a decline in delivery of services, you've saved 2% of the NHS budget. Now, considering we've just raised national insurance contributions, that's going to wipe that out in a second. So I think when you talk about reform, you also, I'll wrap up now because I've talked for a long time. But one thing I would point out as well is they're not going to name a Welsh leader. So there is a possibility that Reform will be the largest party in the Senedd in 2026. They have said that they believe they can form a government, but they have also said they are not going to name a Welsh leader until after that election. So what they are saying to the people of Wales is, vote for us, we will run your government, but we're not going to tell you who the First Minister is going to be. That's a surprise. That's the mystery box, which is, I think, when I spoke to Lee Anderson, I said, do you support devolution? And it's clear that they don't support devolution, but they don't want to say they don't support devolution because then they can be viewed as anti-Welsh. And what they're trying to do is appear a very broad church. What they see devolution as, and he admitted this in this video, which I'm apparently unable to play for you, I'm really sorry. That's bad planning on my part. But he said that the good thing about devolution is it's a chance, because it's proportional, for them to win lots of seats, which will give them lots of resources for a good run at the next general election. So for them, Wales is a vehicle for their personal enrichment in Westminster. And I think opposition parties and journalists need to be making that argument quite clearly to the Welsh public. If that is what people want, then that's fine. Vote for them. But I think that argument is very rarely put across. And I think that's something that we probably need to talk about. I won't take you through the new voting system.
Let's go to questions, because there'll be lots of questions.
Could I just ask you about the newsletter?
Yeah.
So I run a newsletter. It's called the Will Hayward Newsletter. Google it. You can sign up for free. You can sign up for a paid subscription. If you do, you support my journalism. And it's not as long and tedious as the presentation I've just given. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for a brilliant survey of the issues in Wales at the moment. And there'll be lots of questions. I just want to ask one at the beginning. That map of the rail system was very telling and completely backs the view that London doesn't take Wales's interests into account. The Scottish nationalists have made the same argument for the last 20 years and said that if they were able to take Scottish priorities into greater account, Scotland would be more successful. And it hasn't really happened. And the SNP have been drummed out of office, and they are losing support. How convinced are you that what is obviously there in that rail map reflects the reality that if Wales had more powers, that Welsh politicians were able to take Wales's interests into account more assertively in decision making, that would change Wales?
I think obviously what Wales needs more than anything is just effective governance. I do get, you can't look at the setup, how the UK is currently constituted, and think, this makes sense. It doesn't make sense for Wales, doesn't make sense for Scotland, but it also really doesn't make sense for England. Like, I was speaking to someone today who works in policing, very high up in policing, and they were saying that one of the advantages that Welsh forces have over English forces, so policing isn't devolved, so they get their money from Westminster, but the Welsh government will top up parts of their budgets to enable them to do things like outreach in schools, because education is devolved. If you're in England, you're not going to get that. I think a real frustration I have is when people talk about devolution, they'll see, well, the Welsh government doing something ineffectively, and they'll say, devolution hasn't worked. And to me, that's kind of like driving your car through the mountains, and your car breaks down, and you go, well, I don't believe in cars anymore. What you need is a better car. You need something that works better, and I think what Wales really does need is, I think it's, the current system doesn't work, especially if you look at things like justice. So every element of looking after young people is devolved. So if you've got a young person, you've got things like schooling, things like housing, things like Everything, if you're a youth worker, is devolved except for youth justice and policing. So you can't do coherent policies that join up because it's completely haphazard. It's just back of a fag packet. And I think it needs rationalising, but I also think in Wales we need better governance in terms of the opposition, because at the moment you look around and you think, what are the alternatives? And I think that's a really frustrating situation to be in.
Thank you very much. Let's get some questions. Who would like to ask a question? Yes. I'll tell you what Substack is before the end. Don't worry. I'm planning to do that.
The Substack is just my newsletter. It's a website called Substack. But if you type in Will Hayward newsletter, can I just point out, I didn't actually choose that name. I had that same Substack at Wales Online. I wouldn't choose a newsletter with my own name in. That'd be very wanky.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much. And Will, thank you for a fascinating insight into some of the issues around Wales, many of which I hadn't really appreciated before, so thank you for that. Question, I suppose, occurs to me is the Barnett formula. It's something that is quite important for Wales, and is there any appetite, given the coalition along the M4 of the Labour governments, to review the Barnett formula with the prospect of actually improving Wales's lot?
Yeah, so this is a really good example. This graph from before is a really good example of the problem with the Barnett formula, because the Barnett formula is designed in a way that eventually Wales will get funded the same as England. So the way the formula works is year on year, Wales and England get closer. And the problem with that is Wales has got more poverty, it's got worse health outcomes. Like if you were looking at a country and going, right, where do I need to allocate resources? You'd go, oh, this area. But we've got a formula which doesn't account for need at all. It's, one of the reasons it hasn't been reformed is because Scotland does so well out of it compared to Wales. Scotland does much, much better out of the Barnett formula than England does. I mean, even the man who introduced it, Barnett, has said this was not supposed to last for 40, 50 years, for 30, 40 years. This was supposed to be a short-term fix. So I think the problems with the Barnett formula are absolutely huge in terms of appetite for changing it. I mean, the UK Labour just voted down devolution of the Crown Estate, which Scotland has, but Wales doesn't. That would be hundreds of millions of pounds extra coming to Wales. There is absolutely no appetite for further devolution for Wales. And I do think a part of that is because Wales doesn't agitate for independence in the same way the Scots do. The if you're a unionist politician in Westminster, you think, right, we need to appease the Scots in some way. With the Welsh, I mean, Wales has voted Labour for 100 years. It's the most reliable brick in the red wall, and it's got nothing additional. So yeah, I don't think there's any appetite, but I think it does need changing.
Yeah.
Hi, Will. Thank you very much. I didn't know it was called the Barnett formula, but I was going to ask it in a very naive way. But presumably that's a formula that Westminster use to chuck money out to Wales and Scotland, and
yeah,
is that right?
Yeah. So essentially, the Barnett formula. This is I'm going to simplify something which is incredibly complex, but basically Wales is 5% of the UK. So if something is devolved, so NHS, so if healthcare spending in England goes up by 100 million, Wales will get an extra 5 million because it's 5% of the UK.
Is that population?
Yeah,
or
it's
need,
based on it's based completely on population. There is a slight uptick for Wales because it's deemed to be poorer, but not anywhere close to Scotland and not anywhere close to what the relative need is. Now, one of the big problems is, when the budget happens, Chancellor comes out, holds a briefcase, which absolutely should be like a memory stick instead of a briefcase, comes out, and you hear, we are going to put £1 billion extra into the Welsh into the NHS. They'll never say the English NHS. They'll just say the NHS. Journalistically, I then have to work out what Wales is going to get from that. But if that isn't extra money, say housing and health are both devolved. If all they're doing is moving £1 billion from housing into health, that isn't actually any extra money for Wales. It's just because they're not actually increasing the amount spent.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the Welsh government also don't know. The Welsh government find out at the exactly same time as everyone else does how that budget's going to look for them. And how can you possibly long-term plan if you're going to find out 2 months before the money you're going to get? So
Yeah.
it is worked out as a percentage of population.
So my question was going to be, and thank you for that answer. My question was going to be that Barnett formula is totally meaningless, isn't it? Because if the Welsh, as you described, get a lump of money, and for the NHS, let's say, or I can't remember, was it the NHS where they diverted it to something else?
Yes.
So that formula then is not a formula anymore, is it?
It's essentially Wales gets that extra money, and it's up to the Welsh government what they do with it. And that's why HS2, because rail is devolved to Scotland, when HS2 happens in England, they automatically get that money. Whereas in Wales, we only get that money if they define it as an England and only project. And that's what they did. You know the Elizabeth line in London? When that was built, it was seemed, well, this is clearly an England project, so we're going to give Wales some money.
Okay.
Yeah, but if they go and spend it on bacon sandwiches, which clearly they can do, then it's not a formula anymore, is it? It's just...
Well, the Wales still gets the money.
Wales gets the money.
They get the money, yeah.
But it's up to, I mean, that's kind of the purpose of devolution, that the decision around funding should be made as close as possible to the people it affects.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, there's a question on the other side. There we are. Well done. Just getting the microphone to you.
I'm really sorry if this was incredibly depressing. You all look so happy when it started. you all look like I've just sucked the life out of you.
Yeah. Yeah. Lovely.
Just a couple of things, one good, one bad. First, for pollution. If you lived round here for the last 6 months, you won't worry about pollution. We've exported it all to England as soon as it is produced. Okay. Believe me, none of it stays here. The second thing is on how we are treating ourselves as a poor area. What do you think about two methods for doing ourselves good? One, the newest thing is nuclear power station in Anglesey. Turn that down, because that's going to affect the number of Welsh speakers in Anglesey. So never mind the 4,000 jobs, turn it away. We wanted to protect the Welsh language.
Okay.
And the other thing is, you know, who are all these horrible people round here in the shops, spending the money, all these horrible visitors and second homeowners, who do you think is funding Anglesey?
I've got to say, I'm really excited to answer this question. I think it's important to distinguish the difference between pollution and emissions. So pollution is localized, essentially toxins which are in the air, which affect people. It's worse in built-up areas. I know. My apologies. Apparently, I have no sense of humour. If you're asking about issues around second homes, I think, as with every single thing, there is nuance. I think the problem is it's an incredibly emotive subject, and I can understand both sides. I can understand somebody who has lived in an area all their life who wants to send their kids to a local school, but because 40% of houses are second homes, there are fewer kids there, which means schools close, which has impacts on things like Cymraeg and stuff like that. But I can also understand that ultimately we're part of, we are literally, the UK is one state. Not talking about nations, I'm talking about states. And I can understand why someone says, well, I'd like to invest here, I've moved here, I'd like to be part of this community. This is really a thread I don't really want to tug at too hard. I think the loophole closing around business rates for second homes, I think I have sympathy with the desire to manage second homes. I think it was a little bit of a clumsy way to do it, but I also can't necessarily argue with it. But that it's not really I'm not really here to give my physical opinion on every issue. It's more I can talk about the governance and the decisions they make.
Thank you.
That was diplomatic enough.
I mean, one of the striking things about the nuclear issue and being the advice from the planning inspectorate that the language should be taken into account to turn down that nuclear project was that decision was taken in London. Actually, it was the British planning inspectorate. I mean, maybe on advice from voices here, but nonetheless, it was a British decision. Yeah.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I must have misread the invitation because I thought it said challenges facing Wales rugby. But,
Mate, we haven't got enough time for that.
but a very good talk in any event. How important and where does the money for sport and arts come from? Does it just come as a budget from England or from the UK government to be spent as the Welsh government determine?
Well, this is one of the challenges with how funding's allocated. So sport and recreation is devolved. So it's the Welsh Government's responsibility to fund that. However, things like lottery funding can be centralised as well. If you've got elite athletes who are part of Team GB, they can receive funding from lots of different places. So I think the graph there was grant funding from, I think it was from both UK and Welsh Government. It's totally dependent. I mean, and also with recreation, things like play areas come into that, which is local government funding primarily. So it's a hard question to answer, but ultimately the bulk of it is coming from decisions made in Cardiff Bay by the Welsh Government.
Yes, there's a question here, right at the front. If we could get the microphone down. It's on its way. If you want to indicate to me, as the last question's being asked, we'll get the microphone to you quicker. There we are.
Once the camera's off, I'll tell you a funny story about Janet Finch-Saunders, the North Wales MS as well.
Yeah.
Put that bit on YouTube, but then don't show the actual thing. So she sees it, but no, she knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Will. Very interesting talk. Very interesting to have these dilemma, the tensions, as it were, highlighted. What difference what's your take on independence in terms of the difference it would make or not to clarifying where responsibilities lay? I mean,
okay. I think so. I wrote 90,000 words on this and felt like I didn't really do it enough service. So, in terms of answering that question, I'll make 2 points. I think everyone can agree, and however you stand on it, that the UK as currently constituted doesn't work anywhere. I think everyone gets a pretty crap deal unless you live in a certain part of the southeast, and you can see that in how funding is allocated. I think my point I always make to Welsh independent supporters, and what was nice was after the book came out, despite the fact I'm originally from Northampton, they I think appreciated that I approached it with a view of here is something legitimate that deserves analysis. It's not, oh, this is ridiculous or this is great. It was just an objective journalistic look. I think whether or not you want Welsh independence, everyone in Wales should be working towards a point where Wales could be independent, because ultimately we all want Wales to be prosperous. It doesn't matter whether you want it to be part of the UK or not. That should be the ultimate aim, is to get to a point where it could be independent. My argument with, it's not against independence, but these are questions that independence advocates have to talk about. And I could pick anything. I could pick pensions, I could pick currency, I could pick borders. But I'm just going to talk to you about the currency. So there's kind of 3 options for what an independent Welsh currency would be. You either keep the pound, and if you keep the pound, you lose all those fiscal levers you have, like setting interest rates. You go to something like the euro, which you pretty much have the same problem, or you have a Welsh currency, like the pound, call it the punt, the Welsh punt. And then the detail we could go into on that. So for example, when one advocate for independence said to me, well, what we'll do, we'd have the pound for 5 years and then we'd switch to the punt after independence, give us a bit of breathing room. And I'll give you an example, sorry, this won't take long, of Czechoslovakia. So when Czechoslovakia was going to split, everyone knew it was going to split. And what was agreed was, after it splits, they will both use the krona. Slovakia and the Czech Republic will both use the krona for a couple of years. Everybody knew that the second that split, that the Czech krona was going to fly up and the Slovak krona was going to go down. So in the 2 years before, every single Slovakian person was trying to pay off their debts to people on the Czech side as quick as they could, because they knew their currency was going to drop. And every single person on the Czech side didn't want to pay anyone on the Slovak side, because they knew that in about a month, their currency was suddenly going to be worth a lot more. So loads of Slovakian people started putting their money in banks in Prague, because they were like, well, if I just move all my money there, it will suddenly go up overnight. And they actually had to put a currency freeze on how that worked so that that couldn't happen. My point is, this is one very, very small question about what would happen with independence. And I think the indie movement has a lot of merit in lots of ways, but if people are serious about having Welsh independence and not just advocating for it and sticking Yes Cymru signs on stuff, those are the questions that we need to be addressing, not can we do it or not. I have sympathy with, I'd consider myself, I don't even know anymore. I would say, when I'm in England, I say I'm Welsh. When I go abroad, I say I'm Welsh. When I'm in Wales, I kind of say, I'm kind of British Welsh. But I have sympathy with people who, and I understand why people would want an independent Wales. I think there's a hell of a lot of questions to answer.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Apart from just like cry in the corner about everything that you've talked about, or like shout about it in the pub after 4 pints, is there anything that the individual or the like local communities, from your point of view, could be doing more of to affect change?
I'm not going to say subscribe to my newsletter. What I would say is the most important thing in Wales is that we actually are more engaged. So I'm writing my next book at the moment, and part of while I'm in North Wales, I've been doing a lot of interviews. That person I was speaking to the police force, and it's called Who Cares About Wales? So I look at how Westminster has shortchanged Wales. I look at how Cardiff Bay has shortchanged Wales. But the final part of that book is how actually we have a collective responsibility for Wales. I think a lot of people are really happy to stick a daffodil on their head on Six Nations Day, but actually don't proactively take an interest in this country we all profess to really love. And I think Senedd turnout in elections is about 40%, sometimes lower. Like Scotland's 20 percentage points higher. Like if this is a country we value, whatever you're going to vote, engage with it. And I think the very fact you guys have come here tonight to listen to some twat talk about politics shows that you are in that kind of top percentage of people who are engaged with this country. And I think it's making that point to people that this is how we can make Wales better and actually engaging in this thing. And I think younger people massively skew Welsh in terms of identity. I do believe that things are going to change in how people identify with this nation. But I think that is a key way, and it's a very nebulous and a bit of a hippie way of looking at it, but that would be my thoughts.
Thank you, Will. That was very interesting. I've lived in northwest London most of my life and up here quite recently, and I've noticed where the money stops on the way here. But my
M25.
question tonight is, I've read lots of positive things about the generation of green energy in Wales, but I wonder whether we can put it onto the grid easily, or whether that's lagging behind our generation of the actual power.
I mean, that could be a talk in and of itself. So, like green energy, Wales, for the first time in our history, our environment is our physical environment is on our side. The fact that it's incredibly hilly, we've got this craggy coast, which is perfect for tidal power. The fact we have all this wind, like for the first time ever, this is actually going to be beneficial to us. But the problem is, if all of that is essentially extracted wealth, which does nothing for the local communities, there's no community ownership of it, we essentially end up with just a version of the mines 100 years later. I genuinely think that the wealth of Wales is built by empowering the people that walk on top of it, not taking the wealth from under their feet or the wind from above their heads. But in terms of grid capacity, yes, you cannot send electricity from South Wales. Wales is perfect. You could build a tidal energy lagoon in Severn Estuary. You could build one in North Wales. It's perfect because their tides are slightly different times, so you'd have fairly continuous supply. If you had an independence Wales, you cannot send electricity from North Wales to South Wales without using the English part of the grid. It's much like how I had to drive up here.
And the railway.
And the railway. Yeah, I think that's a big debate that's happening now, whether you have pylons, whether you bury them. Pylons are cheaper. Some people will argue about that. I don't actually think you can make that argument. But yeah, that's a big thing. Grid capacity is a huge thing.
Okay, I'm going to take one more because we've been going a long time, but there we are at the back.
Quick one on trees, but that was great, if depressing, what you told us. But we seem to be performing incredibly badly on planting trees.
Yeah.
And yet 1 or 2% of the population has forced the postponement of the 10% insistence under the sustainable farming scheme. So the question is, why have we failed to even get that 10% through? Why have probably the farming community, who are so small in overall terms, had such power over climate change?
I think one of the biggest challenges that, one of the biggest successes that the fossil fuel industry has done is they've been able to portray net zero and growth as opposites, and you can't have both. And I think that is a huge, well, from their point of view, they've done brilliantly. In terms of Welsh Labour haven't helped themselves with how they've spoken about rural communities. So I think you can, if I was a farmer, I mean, I'm allergic to dogs, I'd be rubbish. But I'd have to like farm like reptiles. But also thank you to the people with the dog who moved to the back, I really appreciate it. If I was a Welsh farmer, especially if I was a tenant farmer, I would be feeling like farming is not a normal business. Like a huge sense of identity is linked to that land, to that place, to that particular bit of soil which is theirs and has been theirs for generations. The problem is that the Welsh government have never managed to convey to farmers that they are anything other than an adversary. I think the farming unions bear responsibility for this. I think there's a lot of reasonable farmers who have are willing to and understand the necessity of being more green in how they farm and how they steward the land in Wales, because you go to places like the Brecon Beacons and it is a green desert environmentally. Like a lot of people say, oh, it's really pretty. There is nothing there. There's some sheep, there's some crows, there's a few kites, which we feed. The reason I think that the problem has been, it's been unions and big businesses have been very successful in making it a very divisive debate. And the Welsh government, if they're not going to get farmers on side, have to be strong. And they are not. They are not. The times that they've... I'm so glad we've gone an hour and a half about talking about 20 miles an hour. But like, objectively, that policy in terms of a life-saving perspective has worked, but they've gone the worst of both worlds. They've done this policy that a lot of people dislike, but haven't actually fought for it and said this is why it was good. And actually you've ended up that it's a classic Welsh thing of amazing ideas and then it drops off in delivery. And that is kind of the story of governance in Wales for the last 25 years. I'm not sure I fully answered your question. I think it's basically they haven't been able to bite the bullet on tree planting and facing up to a group of people who are never going to agree with them.
This has been very, very interesting because it's got lots of nuance, lots of complexity, no simple sloganistic answers. Everything's different points of view, all have validity, and you've expressed it incredibly well. So thank you very much for talking to us. And I'm afraid the dog issue means you're going to scoot away fairly quickly, but thank you very much for coming. And
if I stay much longer, I'll be on a Welsh NHS waiting list. So I,
there we are. Good. Very good. Yeah. So very